When Mark wrote his gospel, which most modern scholars today agree was written probably sometime around the year 70 AD, he took up his pen for two main purposes. First one's probably pretty obvious. In 70 AD, it had been about 40 years since the events of the crucifixion. And many of the people who had known Jesus in the flesh were now gone, or were going soon. And so there was, of course, a need at that moment to write things down, to preserve a record of what Jesus had done and said for the future. So that one's kind of obvious. The second reason that Mark had in writing is maybe not quite so obvious to us. Because Mark was trying to help some people in particular by writing this gospel. The people of his own church. Because they were struggling through some very difficult times. And so he wrote down this gospel in order to help them to figure out how to be the church of Jesus Christ in challenging times. And it is this second purpose that Mark had in writing that, for me, makes this gospel so very valuable to us. Because we, 2,000 years later, in many ways are still struggling with that same question. How can we be the church in troubling times? So we need to be able to examine this gospel to find answers to that question. Now, of course, Mark can't really answer these questions for his contemporary church directly, because he does have the job of telling about events that took place over a generation before. So he can't say these things explicitly. What he often does is speak directly to his church in the way in which he chooses to tell the story. For example, there's one long stretch of narrative in the middle of the gospel where basically the disciples and Jesus crisscross the Sea of Galilee. They travel from one place to the next in a boat. And every place they stop on the shoreline, there's a crowd of people for Jesus to preach to, teach to, tend to, or there's some problem that Jesus needs to deal with. Someone to heal, a demon to cast out, or something like that. It happens every time. Now, of course, there is history behind this, because we know that Jesus did travel all over Galilee, and of course he must have traveled many times by boat. It was the most convenient way to travel a long distance. So yes, of course, Jesus did sail across the Sea of Galilee. But the way that Mark tells the story has this really consistent pattern to it. Every single time they stop on the shore, there's a crisis. There's a problem for Jesus to deal with. Even when, as in the passage we read last Sunday, even when Jesus and the disciples head off on the shore to some private and secluded place because they need to rest and relax, even there, as we read last week, the crowds follow them. And Jesus ends up having to take care of all of these people and feed them. So this pattern is so consistent and clear in this gospel that it seems that it's supposed to be a picture of what the church is supposed to be. These shoreline visits are a picture of the outreach of the church. The ongoing outreach of the church, how we as a church are supposed to interact with the outside world by responding to needs, by helping people, healing, feeding the hungry, giving clothes to the naked, and so on. So these shoreline trips represent the ministry, outreach of the church. And the only time in this section of the gospel when Jesus actually speaks to the disciples alone is when they are on these lake crossings. So as they travel across the lake in the boats, it's just Jesus and the disciples. And some really amazing things happen during those crossings, of course. The winds and the waves are stilled. Jesus and Peter go walking on the water. Amazing things. But everything that happens on the lake in the boat seems to be directed towards helping and teaching and edifying the disciples. So if the shoreline visits are a picture of the outreach and mission of the church, those times when they're in the boat are a picture of the internal life of the church. They're meant to be a picture of what happens when the church is alone together, when the church comes together to pray, to worship, and to support and help each other. In modern terms, the disciples in the boat is a picture of what happens when we as a church gather together on Sunday mornings to pray, to worship, to praise, and to grow together in knowledge and grace. That's, by the way, why, to this very day, this part of the church sanctuary, the part where all the people sit, is called the nave. That comes from the Latin word for a boat, the same root in the word navy, because this part of the church is supposed to be that boat, the boat in which the disciples and Jesus are crossing the Sea of Galilee. It's a picture of what the church is supposed to be. So that means, very clearly, that Mark wanted the people who were reading his Gospels, his contemporary Christian friends, to gain important lessons from these stories of Jesus and the disciples in the boat. And if they had lessons to learn from those episodes, well then surely there are things that we can learn too, as we continue to struggle with the question of how to be the church in challenging times. For example, we are told that on one of these crossings of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus just spoke up one day, kind of out of the blue, and he said to his disciples, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of the Sadducees." And it was, to be clear, a pretty odd thing for someone to say, just out of the blue. The disciples, we are told, were kind of puzzled that he should say it. They wondered maybe whether Jesus might have been imbibing certain liquids that had been made with the assistance of yeast. But I've looked at that same Jesus, I've tried to understand it, and I've come to the conclusion that what Jesus was saying in that odd statement in the boat is actually fairly clear and straightforward. You need to understand, first of all, that the ancient Jews had a bit of a mistrust of yeast, a bit of a phobia against it. They knew that yeast was useful, of course. You could use it to make bread, you could use it to make wine and other things. But in that climate, yeast had a way of getting into just about everything and spoiling everything. And so, while they knew its usefulness, ancient Jews really mistrusted yeast and saw it as a dangerous thing and as an unclean thing. That is why, for example, during a certain portion of the year, this is one reason why they would eat their bread made without yeast at all. So, by speaking about yeast, Jesus is clearly warning his disciples, the people in the boat, and us, about something that might infiltrate and spoil the church and take it away from its intended work in the world. Take it far from what it was supposed to be. Now he speaks specifically about the yeast of Herod and the yeast of the Pharisees. Well, in Jesus' world, the Herod and the Pharisees represent worldly power. Herod, the king, represents secular power, as we understand it, and the Pharisees represent religious power and authority. So pretty clearly, the warning that Jesus is giving is that there is a danger from trying to ally yourself or gain the favor of this world's powers and authorities. And he's warning the church against it. So this is a pretty clear warning, and what's more, it's a pretty wise one. Because I'll tell you something. As I look back over the history of the Christian church, this is a problem we have run into as a church again and again. The lure of power in this world. One of the big events in the church was something that happened about 300 years after the time of Jesus, when Constantine, the Roman emperor, converted and became a Christian. And all of a sudden, the Christian church, that had been completely cut off from power in this world, found that it had access to all the power it could have ever wanted. And yes, some of that led to good things. The church now had power, for example, to build beautiful buildings, to commission great works of art, to commission great pieces of music, and all kinds of beauty and good thing came out of that power. The church was in a position, hopefully, to influence society for good. Whether it always did so or not, I'm not sure, but at least it had that possibility. So there was potential good that could come out of this alliance with power. But it also led the church away from so much of what it had been up till that point. And so I think, at the very least, Jesus' warning to be cautious about any sort of alliance with power was a wise one, was a good one. Now, Constantine, I know, is ancient history. So let me give you a couple of more contemporary examples. Several decades ago, our church, the Presbyterian Church in Canada, made an alliance with secular power. It made an alliance with the Canadian government. And it did that in order to do something that at that time the Canadian government and the church thought was a very good thing. Because it was all about education and all about saving and helping Canada's Aboriginal people. But it was an alliance with the powers of this world. And I believe that the yeast of Herod and the yeast of the Pharisees infiltrated that project in very insidious ways, and as a result, a great deal of evil was done and committed against Canada's First Nations, against Canada's Aboriginal families. So much evil, in fact, that we can't even document it. Jesus' warning about the insidious infiltration of the powers of this world into the church was a wise one. Another example struck me even this very morning when I was looking through the news, and I read that a group of pastors and church leaders in Alabama had spoken up and given their endorsement of Roy Moore, who at this point is pretty undeniably has a long record of abuse and sexual harassment, especially of underage women and girls. It's a horrible evil thing for church leaders to do, especially because of what it does for the victims of that kind of sexual harassment who actually sit in the pews of those churches. What message is being given to them? But why were church leaders tempted to do that? The temptation is the temptation to power in this world. It's another case of where the yeast of Herod and the yeast of the Pharisees infiltrates the church and drags it away from what it is supposed to be. I believe that Jesus' warning about yeast was a very wise one indeed. Now, in this story, when Jesus says this, he does give this fairly clear, straightforward lesson about the dangers that do face the church in the future. And the amazing thing is the response of the disciples, which I can't describe as anything other than just plain stupid. The disciples just totally missed the point. Now, in some ways that's not surprising, because the fact of the matter is the Gospel of Mark contains lots of stories about stupid disciples. Disciples who do not understand. This is just one more example. But what's important in this story, I think, is the reason why the disciples don't understand. The reason why they don't get this fairly straightforward message that Jesus is giving is because they're distracted. And what are they distracted about? Well, they're thinking about bread. In other words, they're thinking about their own stomachs. They're thinking about the fact that they don't have enough bread with them on this journey across the lake. They're worried about their own survival and well-being. That's why they miss it. And let me tell you, as someone who has worked in the Christian church for over a quarter century now, who's been associated with several churches through the years, that sounds kind of familiar to me. Because I'll tell you something, every church that I have known or worked with in any capacity have been kind of worried about bread. In other words, they've been worried about their own survival in one way or another. They're worried about paying the bills. They're anxious about just continuing to keep the operation running. Not surprisingly, perhaps, because when you live in times of great change, and we do live in times of great change, that kind of anxiety is all over the place. So I understand where it comes from, but it is a problem, because when you're so worried about bread, what happens is you miss the lesson about the yeast. You miss Jesus' important lessons to us about what we need to be and what we need to do in the world today. That's the problem. That's the bad news. But there is good news, I'm glad to say. Because once this problem surfaces in the boat as they cross the Sea of Galilee, Jesus responds to the disciples where they are. And he does that by asking them a series of questions. That might seem a little bit odd questions, but this is what he asks them. He says to them, when I broke the 5 loaves and for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And then he goes on and he asks them, and the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you pick up? So what is he asking them here? He's asking them questions about their past experience with him. Questions about how God provided for them and for the people they were serving. But he asks very particular kinds of questions. He asks them questions that have very clear and quantifiable answers. Because the answers are specifically 12 and 7, and the disciples can say it. So why does he ask them like this? Well, clearly he's asking them these questions to remind them of how God has been there for them in the past. How God has provided for them. And if they could remember that, maybe they wouldn't be too worried about whether or not God would provide for them now, right? They wouldn't be so worried about bread. But he asked them very specifically to remember not what they felt like, not what it looked like, but very specific details, like how many baskets. Why? Because Jesus understands human nature. And he understands that we have this tendency to focus on the negative, to carry around the negative things that happen, the things that go wrong, the things we get wrong, the times that fail. And that the negative tends to outweigh the positive in our lives, even when there is much more positive than negative. And so Jesus is inviting the disciples to fix on the details of exactly what happened, to remember in detail how God provided. Because they need to dwell on these things. They need to hold on to these things. Otherwise, it will be outweighed by the fears and anxieties and failures of life. Which leads me to this question. If this is our boat, if we are right now, if we were right now in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, crossing the water in our nave, and Jesus were with us, what would he say to us? What would he say to us? Would Jesus be exasperated with us because of our worries about bread, our worries about survival and all of those details of just keeping the lights on? Yeah, perhaps. I think he might be. But he would also be very compassionate. And he would understand our anxieties, and he would try and help us. And you know what? I think he might help us by asking us a few questions. Very particular questions. I think he might say to us, do you remember that time when all of a sudden it seemed we had to replace the heating system, we were going to be in real trouble, and we looked at the quote and man, it was scary. It was so big. How many months did it take to raise the money for that project? How many months? He might ask you, how many years now has it been that Hope Clothing has been running in the basement of this church and helping people in the community, giving them clothes when they don't have enough, with no stable funding whatsoever? And yet somehow you have managed to keep this thing going. How many years? You might ask, how many people came to the Thursday night supper and social this past week and the week before? And how was it that you actually had enough food to feed them all, again with no stable funding? Where did the food come from? How many people? I think he might ask us those kinds of questions. He might ask us to remember specifically those times when God has been here for this church. When God has been there for you personally. And he might ask you to remember details. And you know what? If you don't know the answer to those questions, maybe you should. Maybe we all should. Because maybe if we remembered those things and rehearsed them in our minds, we would be a little bit less worried about bread and confident in God's provision. And more open to deal with the yeasty things that God's calling us to deal with in the world today. Maybe then we would understand. Let's take a few moments in silence.